Forensic science is a key part of criminal investigations, not only to identify offenders and provide expert evidence to the courts, but it is one of the strongest safeguards against false allegations and wrongful convictions. For examining blood patterns to analysing fragments of fibres, the eminent forensic scientist Professor Angela Gallop has worked on hundreds of cases, having set up and ran forensic science laboratories. She has led teams to find vital evidence in many of the UK's most challenging high-profile cases, such as Stephen Lawrence, Damilola Taylor and Rachel Nicholl. In her new book, How to Solve a Crime, she describes some of her own and her colleagues' most intriguing cases and the wide range of skills and techniques used to solve them. Happy to say she joins us now. Thank you for joining us, Angela.
Not at all, it's my pleasure.
Well, let's talk about something that really struck me, the idea that forensics can be anything and everything we encounter in daily life. Explain that to us a bit more.
Yes, I think it's because crime happens, where we are, whether it's in the domestic environment or whether it's when we're at work or at leisure, whatever, wherever it is, that's where it happens. And so the traces that we look for as forensic scientists come from those sorts of environments and obviously the people in them and people involved. And so that's why it can be absolutely anything.
And your book talks us through that. There's a chapter almost on every element, everything we touch, everything we feel. And water is one of those. And I'm keen to get your reaction to smart water being used to catch someone in this domestic violence case.
Yes, it's very interesting. I mean, smart water itself has been around for quite a long time, and applied to high value items that people might want to steal. So if they do, then they get contaminated by this substance that you can then, link directly and uniquely to them. But it's very interesting seeing it applied to actual people, being sprayed on people and being used as evidence in that way. But I think that anything that makes women feel safer and that makes it easier to catch the people who attack them and get that side of it right, then must be better.
Yes, and I mean, you talk a great deal about how the industry has evolved over the years, and I do want to get into that a great deal. But one of the things that stood out for me in the book is that you say that there are few cases that can't be solved, and how every contact leaves a trace. So explain to us why so many cases remain unsolved.
Well, I think it's just the way in which they're investigated and the amount of resources that's devoted to them. I think it must be that in the end of the day, because obviously, if you investigate every case to the extent that you might need to solve it, then that might be sort of financially unsustainable. So there are always decisions to be taken, and there's triaging, and there's all that kind of stuff that goes on. But I think I say that because, with these, particularly these complex old cases, we have been amazed ourselves at actually the fact that it usually one manages to sort it out. And I think, just the names of these cases, I think that kind of demonstrates that point.
Your work has been extensive. You worked on investigations since the 1970s, and it was at the age of 27 that you encountered your first dead body. Tell us about that.
Yes, I wasn't sure how I was going to be. You never are. People aren't until you're faced with something like that. So I'd never seen a dead body before, and I was very nervous that I didn't, fall over and embarrass my colleagues. But I found that actually, fortunately, I'd got a fairly strong stomach and it was fine. But that victim was an incredibly important case. They're all really important at that level. But it was one of the Yorkshire Ripper series, and we were so desperate with the police to try and find whoever was doing this, because obviously he was just going to continue until he was caught. And so it was just, but I suppose I realised then that at that early stage that actually something comes over you when you go to a crime scene or you start working on a case, that you're just so determined to see how well you can do if you can just, if there is evidence there, so squeeze it out somehow. All your energies and thoughts go into that process, and you don't have so much time to think about the normal emotional side of things, which you otherwise might dwell on, and which might make your job more difficult.
But Angela, what an incredible high-profile introduction to your industry at the tender age of 27.
Absolutely, it really was.
Absolutely. I mean, the arrival of DNA then in the 1980s. So you started in the 1970s. Then we had the
Yeah,
1980s. The
yeah.
arrival of DNA profiling. That was a real game changer for your
Oh,
sector,
yes.
wasn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, before then, with blood grouping, if you managed to get grouping results, you needed quite a lot of material to get results from that. But if you managed to get a set of results that gave you a frequency of occurrence in the population of about 1 in a few thousand people, you thought that was quite good evidence. Whereas now we have sort of 1 in a billion routinely for a full profile. So it has completely changed everything. And of course, these days we can get DNA profiles out of truly tiny amounts of material.
It's changed things, but it's part of a wider toolbox of
Yeah,
utensils that you have at your disposal
yeah,
to use everything from plants to dust to
everything.
fluff. And you talk about your most valued informants. We have DNA, but what is that in your opinion?
Well, what the most valued
Absolutely,
informant?
yeah.
Oh, well, I'm very keen on dust and fluff, as I call it, but it's the sort
And
of
that would intrigue
tiny,
people. You've studied
it,
forensics
yeah,
for decades. You're a scientist, and yet you talk about
yeah.
dust and fluff. And that stood out
Well,
for me as well.
absolutely. It's these tiny things that you can't really see that people don't notice. I mean, it depends on the case. Obviously, sometimes it's a whacking great blood stain that no one could miss, but very often it's these tiny amounts of material, and it's so subtle, forensic science, which is another reason why I wanted to start writing about it for the general public. In that, sometimes to find the thing you're looking for, if there's a tiny amount of it, like in the Stephen Lawrence case, for example, actually we only found the blood in that case because we'd been looking for tiny individual textile fibers, and that was all very microscopic. And that was how we came across this tiny blood stain, which actually, in the end, was the most significant part of the forensic evidence. So dust and fluff is really, really important, and we have to maintain our skills in it.
And the Stephen Lawrence case is just one of many high profile cases that you have worked on over the years. You've dealt with countless horrific cases of murder, many femicides, other horrific crimes. So, how have you over the years learnt to remove, almost step away from the emotion involved with what you are faced with, if at
Well,
all?
as I say, I think it's that thing, that feeling that comes over you when you start a case or when you turn up at a crime scene or you go to court. It's that feeling I've got to do my very best. This is so important. It's why I want to do applied science in the first place rather than carry on researching or do some other kind of science. For me, the application of science is extremely important. The immediate benefit that it can bring is really important. And so I find that helps, that focus on the here and now and doing my best job seems to take away the time that I would otherwise spend musing about how absolutely ghastly it is that this has happened to someone. I mean, I absolutely think that. It doesn't remove my emotions from me, I have to say. And I will think about that in quiet times. But I think, generally speaking, I'm far too focused on what we're actually doing and how we're going to get to the bottom of something,
Think
which
about
is
that in
which is
quiet
good.
times, yeah, yeah. But obviously, not every case can be solved, and sometimes you're left hanging, and that must really play on you.
Yes, I mean, sometimes it does. I talk in the book about this one particular case. It was a young girl who was found mutilated. Her body had been dumped by the river in Windsor. And she was naked and everything. And she'd been dumped there. There was no crime scene was ever discovered. And obviously who'd done it was incredibly dangerous. And we just seemed to get absolutely nowhere, the police and ourselves. But then years later, over 30 years later, the case was connected with another case where somebody got convicted, and it was possible for us to go back to those samples that I'd taken at the crime scene and not from the body of the girl all those years earlier. It was possible to go back to them, get some DNA profiling of results of them, and compare that and show that actually there was a connection with this chap who got convicted of the other crime. So really, really sort of, interesting that you never give up hope. You never say never on a case because you just don't know.
Well, that is interesting. But of course, there are miscarriages of justice, and a single mistake in your field can lead to a wrongful conviction.
Yeah.
There have been some concerns about some firms not meeting quality standards. Just how reliable is the industry as a whole?
I think, like everything, it's got some very concerning aspects to it at the moment. I think if you're an independent company, and in most areas of forensic science, not all yet, not some of the newer areas, but in most areas, you have to have proper quality standards and you have to work to them and show that you pass them all, or the police will simply not use you. And that is absolutely right. I think my concern about forensic science in more recent times is that because of funding pressures, and there are tremendous, as everybody knows, funding pressures on all sorts of public services, but no less the police. And this is causing them to start doing some of the early forensic science work themselves. And it includes searching for things. And searching is incredibly important. It sounds a bit boring, doesn't it? Looking, seeing,
Not at all in your sector, no.
Test. But that is where you either find something or you miss it or you lose it or you compromise it. It's so important that. And it also helps you understand what you've got and what it means in the case when you finally do start getting results. And so I want to raise the question. I mean, it's for society to answer generally, but whether it's right that the police should be forced into this position when they are doing more and more of forensic work, but they're part of that little hunting down the criminal prosecuting machine. Should they really at the same time be attempting to provide independent, impartial scientific evidence? So I think that's a question that we must ask ourselves. It's about that, it's about funding, and that the funding is a broad issue. It's about what you do in an individual case, but it's also about the skills that you maintain. You know, some of these skills, like textile fibers, my favorite, dust and fluff point, now that they're being lost. We have many, many fewer people who can do that kind of work, can do textile fiber analysis and comparison these days than we used to have. And that cannot be right. Stephen Lawrence and the Pembrokeshire murders, they were absolutely dependent on doing fiber work first. And it was the fibers that led us to the DNA, which really nailed it.
And you talk you talk about dust and fluff being sidelined. We also have the rise of digital forensics being used, don't we? And I wonder whether that's played a part in organic sources, I call them, grassroots sources being sidelined more and more.
Yes, and I mean, to a certain extent, you would expect there to be a shift in emphasis from, one type of evidence to another type, and that's fine, and that's a sort of natural progression, and everybody understands that. But it's just in the meantime, if you do your digital work and don't get any connections, any links, then what are you left with if you haven't even taken the samples, which would allow you to use, other kinds of techniques? I think it's really important to keep as wide a range of forensic techniques as possible if you're really going to live up to, what I say about it should be possible to solve the vast majority of cases. That is what our work has shown, and it absolutely lives up to that principle that was first espoused in 1910. Every contact leaves a trace, that you referred to earlier. When I was a young scientist, you'd say, yeah, every contact leaves a trace. But in this case, no, really, maybe not because of this, that, and the other. We were completely wrong. Every contact does leave a trace. It's just whether or not you're clever enough to find it.
Angela, you talk about inspiring the next generation of forensic scientists, especially young women. If there is a young woman out there listening to you, thinking about a career in this sector, what advice would you give her?
I think for me, it's been absolutely fascinating and extremely rewarding, very tough. So I think the first thing to do is to understand, the different aspects of it. And not just the end bit when you've got the evidence and you're presenting it, but everything that leads up to that, and just to try and make sure that you've got the right kind of personality and the right kind of qualities for it, and then get yourself a nice bit of solid science education, and then give it a go. I mean, lots of people are as passionate as I am about forensic science, so it's not just me. I think a lot of people enjoy it and find it very rewarding. So I would obviously try and persuade new people into the profession. It needs new blood. It needs new ideas.
And I advise picking up a copy of your book, How to Solve a Crime. Very insightful, a toolbox on how to understand the world of forensics. Thank you so much, Professor Angela Gallop, there talking to us about her new book.